Hey, everybody, this is Nathan. I'm here with Ben and Jake. Hello, guys.
Hey, Nathan.
So we've got kind of an interesting, awkward thing to talk about here. You may be hearing this in the Sound of Sanity podcast feed or the Sanity at the Movies feed or the Bookening feed. We're recording the same thing and we're releasing it on all three podcasts. If you listen to all three of them or subscribe to more than one of them, I apologize. You're going to see the same thing come across your feed. But we wanted to make sure that the right people heard this, so we couldn't decide which one to actually drop it in, and we decided it's not really going to hurt anything to just drop a brief little thing in all three of our primary podcast feeds. So, long story short,
trademark it.
Yeah, trademark it. Talk to our copyright, talk to our lawyer. Well, this does involve lawyers, although I hope not too much. So, we got an email not too long ago from a friend and someone that we used to go to church with and a fan of ours who listens to the podcasts. Wonderful lady. And she said, hey, have you guys heard the Bookening podcast? Apparently she was just searching for podcasts on such and such a book.
She wanted a Christian take on, I don't know, I think it was Lewis's Space Trilogy or something like that.
And so she stumbled across in her search just randomly a podcast called
Bookening
It. And this is a podcast that has certain similarities with the Bookening podcast that we've been doing for 6 or 7 years now. And she was like, hey, have you guys, I think these guys might just be doing your thing, ripping you off a little bit. And so we went and we listened to the Bookening It podcast. And I came to realize it's actually done by a gentleman who has been like a $5 supporter on one of our patrons. I guess I'll just go ahead and say, because you can figure it out pretty easily for yourself. His name is Cooper. He's the host of two shows. Is it? One's called The Screening and one's called Bookening It. And the Bookening It especially just simply, there's no other way to say it. It just rips off things that we do in the Bookening It and the Bookening.
So, for example, if you were to open up the Bookening podcast and click play, you would hear Nathan say, coming up next, the Bookening reads.
Right.
Whatever we read. And then he would introduce himself as your humble and obedient host and do a little bit of shtick about our good friend Billy S., the immortal bard of Stratford-on-Avon. And if you were to click on the Bookening It podcast on, say, their recent episode on Hamlet, you would hear it begin with, coming up next, the Bookening It reads.
With music and then
Hamlet. Hi, I am Cooper, your humble and eloquent host. We're going to be talking today about Billy S., the immortal bard.
Yep. And
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And there's other things, like for the Bookening specifically, if you listen to the Bookening, this is, again, the thing we're recording appearing in more than one feed. But if you're a Bookening fan, we have certain segments like Baggage Check and the donor shout-outs thing at the end where we shout out the donors and we give them little silly nicknames and stuff like that. These guys are literally doing that stuff. They literally are like, okay, now it's time for our donor shout out segment. Now, what kind of a plant do you think that we just read the Day of the Triffids? So what kind of a malevolent plant do you think that this such and such a character, it's just without varnish, without alteration. It's just a thing that we do.
And then if you go a little bit farther and look at their Patreon accounts or their descriptions of their shows, you find that they also just sort of ripped off our copy.
Yeah. And so then you sort of wonder what else they ripped off, and if you're
in terms of takes and insight and any number of other things.
Right. And okay, so is this so you look at it, you see they're doing two podcasts, a movie podcast, a book podcast. The book podcast in particular is explicitly ripping off things that we do. They explicitly copied and pasted stuff from our patron descriptions and stuff like that. They're also just doing stuff in our style, which, you know, we're not the inventors of three guys sit around and have a goofy discussion, but it's pretty obvious that it's in our rhythms and using some of our insights too. And maybe even using some of our book list or movie lists. But, you know, I don't think any of us had the patience to go through and
catalog it.
What
we did instead, because it's like, all right, We've all been there where we've been inspired by people or been fans of people.
But I don't think we said these guys are, this makes a big difference. These guys are in high school.
Are we sure about that?
We're 90% sure. They were in high school at least at some point during the run of the show, whether they are, it's been going for three years now.
Okay. So they at least got started in high school at some point. So they're younger guys. All right, so they're fans, but they also have 40 or some reviews on their show, and they're making money off of it.
They have Patreons.
They're not pulling a lot of money out of it, but they're in our space using our stuff and collecting an audience with our stuff. And at the same time, it's like, okay, these are kids, they're fans.
Yeah, I mean, I think
he's been a supporter financially of our shows.
If it was just a thing here or a thing there, or just kind of, you could tell he was enamored with the rhythms of how I talk. And he was just, you can certainly hear early podcasts that we did where if you know what to look for and what to listen for, you can hear who I'm enamored with. I understand that creativity and stuff like that is messy and you draw inspiration from places,
and everything is derivative until you find your own voice, but your own voice is ultimately a composite of
but unfortunately
your parents and your artistic influences and everything else. But this goes a step beyond that to the point that it is in fact it's something that we talked to an IP lawyer about. Our lawyer is intellectual property lawyer. Now, we didn't start there. Our initial thought was, look, okay, if we were kids who got caught at doing the same thing and maybe it got a little bit bigger than we imagined, we did it for our friends and family. It was an experiment. We were playing around and then it took off and got legs of its own. And now it's a thing. And then we got caught at it. How would we want somebody to approach us? And we thought, well, okay, let's just reach out privately to this guy or to these guys and see if we can have a conversation with them, which we did.
We did reach out.
We reached out. We did not have a conversation because I think it was Nathan who reached out, said, hey, we'd like to have a conversation, got a response. Okay, sure, what about? And Nathan said about podcasting or about your podcast or something like that, and then no response. And this is a couple months ago now.
Yeah, this is a while ago.
And still no response. And so that's when I decided, hey, no harm in talking to our lawyer.
Who happens to be an IP lawyer.
Yeah, an intellectual property lawyer is his specialty. And hey, guess what? We engaged in the creation of intellectual property, so it's appropriate for us to be talking to that kind of person, have a good relationship with him. And so he was like, look, we can send a cease and desist. We can sue. We can go to Apple or Google and just because it's a violation of terms of service, just have Apple or Google shut it down. It's just a question of time and dollars and how punitive you want to be. Or you can try to take another intermediary step and see if you can't resolve it without further escalation.
Which is what is
what we're doing now. This is an intermediary step where we want to say, guys, look, we're flattered.
You have a good taste?
I'm flattered, especially.
Yes, yeah. You should be especially flattered.
Yeah, I am.
But what you're doing is wrong, and you have to stop.
It's theft. It's a violation of the 10 Commandments to create and package your content in a way that takes so much directly from us without asking permission or giving us credit is to profit from our work. So it's lying and it's theft. It's something that, if we didn't make it clear also, it's a Christian podcast. That's what they say. That's how it's presented. So we assume these are brothers in Christ.
But they're bringing dishonor to the name of Christ.
Right.
In how they're engaging this.
Yeah.
It is dishonest and it is theft.
And the only reason that it feels small is because you guys haven't taken off. If for whatever reason they did actually take off, suddenly we'd be in a world, suddenly they'd find themselves in trouble because suddenly we would have a competitor who had stolen a bunch of stuff from us, who is profiting from it in a big way instead of the relatively small one that they have heretofore. And people would be looking at us like, did you rip off the Bookening podcast? And
then we'd have to prove that we were there first.
That would just be simple self-preservation on our part. Doesn't matter how we feel about it. We would want to protect ourselves at that point. So these guys are doing something dangerous and something sinful. And luckily, by God's grace, it hasn't escalated into anything that's all that
damaging to anyone.
Yeah. But it does need to stop.
Yeah, it needs to stop. And so what we would like is for you guys to stop and to apologize publicly.
Mm-hmm.
We would like you to either pull your shows and put up apologies to your fans and give us credit for our work, our creative work. Or change your shows. And if you want to keep your back catalog, put apologies at the front of every episode.
Right. Which is not impossible. You just recorded an apology. I actually did it. The early Sound of Sanity episodes have a little explanation like, this is what the show used to be, that I had to go and fill in.
And that was just for people who discover our show now and go back into the back catalog and are like, what's going on with this?
Right.
I don't understand.
I just put a little preamble. I actually think that some of their early shows have a preamble where they say like, which means they already obviously know how to add something to one of these. Make a new MP3 and upload it. That's all you have to do.
This is, in other words, this is our polite cease and desist before we take some kind of escalated action, which we are assured by our IP lawyer we are well within our rights to do.
Yeah. So their production company is actually 412 Productions is what they call themselves, which I assume is a reference to 1 Timothy. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct and love and faith and purity. So that's an ironic thing for you guys to have as your production thing, if this is what you're going to do. But you can still live up to it. And I don't despise you for your youth. If this is just a mistake of youth, if it was simply thoughtless, then, it can be repented of very easily, and we're not out to destroy you. But
it actually needs to be repented of. And what you've done is you've cultivated an audience under false pretenses. You need to come clean with them.
Mm-hmm. And if your host is the only one that knows, then I think he needs to apologize to his friends for drawing them in. Who knows what the dynamic is, how familiar they all are with our work. Certainly the host is familiar with our work and using it.
Again, a patron of our shows.
Right.
So that's how we had his contact info in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
To reach out to him. So there's no denying.
Yeah, he didn't just...
You can do the math. You can go listen to the shows and do the math. Or you can listen to the shows, do the math, and also realize that he's been supporting our shows as a fan directly. So,
yeah, I mean, in one of the Ville episodes, I used a piece of music that I later found out I didn't have the rights to. And some guy reached out to me and was like, hey, you use this piece of music and it's not available for you to use. And he was upset. And I had misunderstood, but I had also maybe wanted to misunderstand, like I had been careless in where I was getting my music. And so I just had to eat crow and apologize and say, I'm sorry. And then I had to, at some personal trouble and expense, recreate. I think we had to have the whole cast redo a scene or something like that, and then rescore it, re-edit it, re-put it together. And it was a pain. It's not quite at the level of pain that unfortunately these guys have gotten themselves into, but I've had it happen.
And we all have on one level or another, whether we realized it or not. Maybe we didn't make the mistake of doing it in public for profit, but we have all borrowed too much.
Wrote that high school short story.
Yeah,
you look back on it and you're like, oh, that's just, I was doing my Cormac McCarthy phase.
Ripping off this person.
Yeah.
I was ripping off their style. I was ripping off their shtick. I ripped off their story. I ripped off. And so there's something natural about that. And there's something not even unwholesome. If I go back and look at my earliest sermons, you're going to hear John Piper, you're going to hear Tim Bailey, you're going to hear any number of other people that some of that's just a son imitating his fathers, right? Like, but some of it, if I were to go back, especially the early days when I was like still training for ministry and cutting my teeth in college ministry, man, I know that I would be so embarrassed to go back and listen to Jake trying out his John Piper voice or his Tim Bailey voice or his whoever else voice, until I worked into something that was more me.
Right. There's that, and that's so true. And I think that's a large part of what it looks like is going on here. It's also true that probably you didn't quite just copy and paste the John Piper,
right.
which is a little bit closer, unfortunately, to what these guys have done. And listen, there's even been places where I've been like, oh, you know what? I didn't think I was ripping off a Simpsons joke for Chip and Lance, but now I think back on it and I'm like, well, I guess I was doing calisthenics in my own mind to say that it was different. So I do understand these things, but as Jake says, everybody's going to have things they look back on and think either that was a mistake or maybe that was a little bit more than a mistake and I wanted to believe something. this is unfortunately gone a little farther than
across several lines. I mean,
and cross them consistently over time.
Yeah, and all you have to do is click on any episode of the Bookening, listen to the first 10 minutes, then click on any episode of the Booking It podcast and listen to the first 10. Listen to the first 10 and or last 10 or first 3 and the last 3 minutes of any one of our episodes and any one of their episodes. And what you're going to find is pretty representative how far they've gone in just one-to-one taking our show.
Yeah, and then there's the matter of directly copying and pasting copy. Just not stealing a style or even a motif, but just
actual copy,
taking actual written content and just presenting it as your own is extremely not cool. So this is not an angry podcast. It hasn't escalated to the level where our personal finances are threatened by this or anything like that, or we have any reason to be anything but wanting to help some brothers in Christ be who they should be. As Jake says, if it doesn't change, we will be forced to escalate the matter.
And we will.
And we should.
And we should. Yeah. But we hope it doesn't come to that. And I don't know if they still listen to us or still pay attention.
We're putting it in all 3 feeds. This is our...
Putting it in all 3 feeds. We're putting it out there. If you, listener, want to try to find a way to bring it to their attention, feel free. I don't know how you would do that.
Yeah.
I guess you could put a review on their show, but don't be petty if you do.
No, I mean, I think there's a way to defend our honor justly if you wish to do that. But yeah, don't be mean. Don't be petty. Okay, so I think we'll leave it there for now. Anything else you guys want to say about this?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for listening.